I think I
You'll give me a cue when you want to actually start. Yeah. Okay. So it looks like we don't need to tweet this. Looks like
no, I don't think we did. Yeah, here today.
Such an exciting life. Acronyms. Okay, welcome to this ESRC-sponsored Festival of Science. Glad to see such a good turnout for it. This particular event is put on by CAS, the ESRC Center for Corpus Approaches to Social Sciences. I'm not from CAS, but there's three reasons I think why I am chairing today. The first one is that I am chair of BAL, the British Association for Applied Linguistics, which is an organization with 800 members, many of whom are interested in corpus approaches. And there's a corpus special interest group and a corpus colloquium every year. Now, I want to start with BAL's definition of applied linguistics, which is from Chris Brumfitt, the study of real-world problems in which language plays a part. So that can serve as an introduction to what we're going to hear about tonight. Real-world problems and language playing a part. So we're going to start with Václav Prasina, talking about language learning, which for many people is what applied linguistics means, language learning. And it certainly is an enormous industry in Britain, but also a crucial hurdle and line stage for many people around the world, leading to very high stakes exams. So getting that right is a very important part for the lives of many people. Then we're going to go on to Claire Hardacre, talking about a quite different kind of real-world problem, online aggression, something that's in the press almost every day, and Claire is asked about it almost every day, it seems. Then in her approach, applying corporate to this problem means looking at the broad background of online aggression and the language used, instead of it just the particular tweet that has the attention of the Daily Mail today. So she's using this to get a broader and more systematic background to what's going on in online aggression. And then we come to the real-world problem that none of us can avoid, death. And Elena Semino will be talking about end-of-life care. Now, you might think that end-of-life care was not a language problem. You might think that end-of-life care needed drugs and medical care, but obviously communication plays a very large part of it. Communication in end-of-life care has been studied a long time, but again, Elena and her colleagues are able to use large collections of language to talk much more systematically about the kind of language used in end-of-life care. And finally, we're going to have Robbie Love and Claire Demry, and if we're lucky, we'll have Tony McHenry arriving just in the nick of time from Beijing to talk about change in language itself. Now, language change is not a problem. Linguists don't think of it as a problem, but certainly the media think of it as a problem, as something that needs to be explained as the decline of language, as terrible things happening to it, as it becoming, God forbid, more American. And what we see from them is a much more systematic study and also a prelude to a much larger study that they're planning. So that will be a good way to end off today's series. Now, the second reason I'm invited is that I'm chair of the Department of Linguistics, following two of the other people who will be speaking today. Our department, Linguistics at Lancaster, started working with the late Jeff Leach, started working on corpora 40 years ago. And in those early years, it was focused mainly on applying corpora to language and especially lexicography, funded by dictionary makers. So it's interesting today to note how it's been applied to much wider things. And that means not just the trivial problem of taking the same stuff and applying it to social problems, but finding much larger and different kinds of data, much different ways of searching it, and much different ways of interpreting that. And the people at CAS have been crucial in making that sharp turn in the application of corpora. The third reason that I've been asked to chair it today is that Amanda and the other people organizing it know that I have a watch and a very loud voice. So I will keep people strictly to time. That's not just because I'm mean, but because I know that the point of your coming down here today and of people watching this and listening to it online is that you want to ask questions, and I want to make sure they don't just rattle off their PowerPoint slides. So I will be keeping people strictly to time, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. Okay, then can we move on? Václav, could you lead off then?
All right, thanks very much, Greg, and thanks very much to you all for coming to this event. I will be talking about the process of learning a foreign language, a language that we learn in addition to our mother tongue. And this is a fascinating, intriguing, but also a very complex process. And I will be talking about some of the evidence we have from language corpora about this process, some of the findings that we have based on empirical evidence that comes from the analysis of large amounts of language, computational analysis. So this is what I mean by corpora, language corpora. Thanks very much. And in particular, I will be talking about spoken learner corpus. I would like to start with a language myth, something that I call a language myth. But before we do that, I would like to just run a quick survey among our audience. Could you please raise your hands if you've ever learned a foreign language in a classroom or in any context? And could you please keep your hands up if you found this process straightforward and easy? Yeah, we have some talented linguists among ourselves, which is great, but I think most people find the process challenging for a number of reasons, and I will be talking about some of them. I think the reasons are also connected to what I already mentioned, is the big central language myth about learning a foreign language. Until recently, people have conceptualized language as grammar and vocabulary, and when you put these two together, you have your language. And also the pedagogical attention, what teachers do in the classroom, was largely focused on grammar and vocabulary. In this talk, I would like to show you that actually language learning involves much more than that, and we need to pay attention to other aspects as well. So let me give you a very concrete example. Here's a transcript from our learner corpus, and we'll be focusing on speaker 1 as 1, because this is the speaker of Italian background who uses English as their second language. When you look at the transcript and just glance over it, you might notice some grammatical errors or lexical errors, and the sort of teacher in me would sort of take out a marker and almost sort of try to correct these. However, when you focus on those, the sort of subject-verb agreement problems, missing subject in the first utterance, you miss a very important aspect of this transcript and of the learner production. This aspect is what I call pragmatic appropriateness. And let me explain what I mean by this. Here, this is the same transcript, but this time I didn't highlight the grammatical inaccuracies, but I highlighted things that are very important for communication in English. Things that in linguistics we call pragmatics or subsume under the field of pragmatics, that are connected to the way we communicate in different contexts, the way we engage with our audience, with the other speaker in this case, the way we position ourselves. And here I would say the speaker, the Italian speaker from our corpus, is much more successful. And let me just highlight one of the examples. The debate is about whether change is a good or a bad thing. And speaker 1 tries to get across the idea that change is a positive thing, whereas speaker 2 is a bit more conservative, saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be so excited about change. But look at the way speaker 1 actually expresses a disagreement with speaker 2. Speaker 1 says, I agree with this point, but don't you think maybe the fact that times are changing is a good thing? I think speaker 1 actually manages this situation really well, acknowledging the point of view of the second speaker, yet being able to express their point of view very clearly, using these sort of tiny words in language that matter. Another area that I would like to briefly mention is an area that I call active listenership. When we focus on learning a foreign language, we very often focus on production, how we speak, how we write. But what is a very important area of this process is how we react to other people speaking. So let me give you an example. This is another example from the Trinity Lancaster Spoken Learner Corpus. And just notice, again, we are focusing on speaker 1, a different speaker this time. And notice these tiny words. In linguistics, we call these back channels. They are very important because they indicate, A, that the speaker understands what is going on, but also it shows very close engagement with what the other speaker is saying. Yes, go on, I understand, and occasionally the speaker asks clarification questions. So a very important part of this is how we react to what other people are saying. And finally, I would like to talk about idiomatic language. Idiomatic language is all about words in context and words in combinations. When we learn language, we acquire words not as single individual units, but we acquire them through context. And the context is very important. I will show you one specific example of the verb take. The verb take in English is a very general one. Literally, it means to grab one thing and move it from one place to another. But the verb take is more often used in combination with other words, such as nouns or adjectives, to mean some abstract concepts, metaphorical uses. And here I want to show you at 3 different proficiency levels how learners actually acquire different uses and combinations of the verb take. So this is the lowest level from our corpus, the pre-intermediate level or B1 level of the Common European Framework. If you know this classification. And here what you can see is, apart from the concrete examples, take money from the bank or from ATM, we get some of the metaphorical uses, such as take care or take part. Yet what we can also see is that, and this is based on 300 odd different speakers, so these are sort of all speakers subsumed, and these are the frequent salient combinations of words. Yet we can see that there are only a handful of those at this level. Let's move up one level, and these are the intermediate users. Again, 300 something different users of the English language. And here we, apart from the take care and take part from the previous slides, we also get some other metaphorical or phrasal verb uses, such as take out, take off, and take place. When we move to the final level, the sort of C1, C2 level of the Common European Framework, the most advanced speakers in our corpus, you get an even more complex picture. Again, those ones from the previous slides are there, but you get examples such as take into account, take advantage, or take responsibility. So again, very, very complex metaphorical uses that are present there. And when we put these slides one next to another, we get almost a real-time view of the language development from the lower intermediate up to the most advanced use. So just to summarize, and I will finish with this slide, there are many more things about learning a language, a foreign language, than just grammar and vocabulary. I talked about the importance of active listenership, the importance of pragmatic features that are based on a particular context and how we handle the individual situations in a particular context. Also, we need to acquire language that is idiomatic, that flows naturally. And this is done through these very special combinations, and there are hundreds and thousands of them in a language. And through language corpora, we can actually observe them and observe their acquisition almost in real time, as I showed you from the previous slides. And we are really excited about this Learner Corpus project, because our hope is that with the data that we have available, we will be able to assist language learners and their teachers, so that the process of acquisition of a foreign language can be much more efficient and also much more enjoyable. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Václav, and thanks for keeping to time so I didn't have to get out my hook and pull you off the stage. So we have 8 minutes for questions. Do you want to, and questions from online? Let me ask one while they're starting off. What do the position of the collocates on your graphs mean in distance and direction?
Right. Yeah, as you said, this is a sort of the graphs I showed in the previous slides, and I might show them, go back to them so people can actually see them here. The positions mean the closeness of the relationship. So, for instance, take care, the length of the arrow, and this is a sort of graph produced automatically by a corpus tool that we are developing at CAS at the moment, shows the intimate relationship between take and care based on the frequency of co-occurrence of these two words. Take account is again a very close collocate of the verb take, whereas take place is further apart on this graph. So yes, there is still a strong relationship, but not as strong as with the other collocates.
Okay, I've given people, yes. Well, I think we need to give you a microphone so that people who are listening to the streaming can hear you. And could you say who you are so that people will know?
Okay, I'm Sharon Glass, and so I'm wondering if for language teachers you might suggest that the closeness of the collocates might give you an order in which you would teach those particular uses.
I think this is a very interesting thought, and yes, we have computational tools that can actually give you that type of information to highlight the most important collocates based on the data. So I would say yes, this is something that certainly needs to be explored.
Thanks. Another.
I'm Daria Daita, University of Bayreuth. I was wondering if you had a chance to look at the active listenership strategies in relation to the learner's background, because I would think that back channel noises, it's something universal. I mean, you don't have, it's not something that's so important for second language learner. You would produce back channel noises even if you have very low competence in the language. Is my intuition correct or not?
Based on our data, actually not. Well, you get differences according to L1 backgrounds, the background, the cultural background of the speakers. Yet what we find in our data is that the more successful learners actually are able to do these things much more than the less successful learners. And although it would sound sort of almost universal, there are sort of special strategies and not only that's back channeling sounds, but also asking questions in the right places that sort of contribute to this active listenership idea. So I think that's a very interesting question, but it makes a lot of difference in our data when you look at the more successful and less successful candidates in these.
Oh, it's really interesting because you wouldn't think you'd need to learn much language to say, but it is, yeah. Other questions? Mark? Oh, sorry.
Well, I am Nan Chun from Beijing Foreign Studies University. If I understand you correctly, I think you have learners of different linguistic backgrounds trying to learn English in your corpus. So are you observing the different patterns that people of different backgrounds are following in learning English? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very important question. Yes, and we are looking at different factors that contribute to this process to be able to disentangle this very complex process. We are looking at different ages because we have people from the age of 8 to the age of 72. So again, you can see how people learn English at various stages of their life, different genders, and different other factors, age of acquisition. So we know a lot about these things, about these people, and we actually explore their stories to be able to tell our story about language learning.
Okay, I think there was a question over here too. So yeah. First.
I have a question from Google Plus from Sharon Hartle, and she missed the beginning of your talk. She wants to know the name of the corpus, but also will it be available to teachers?
Right. The corpus is Trinity Lancaster Spoken Learner Corpus, and yes, we are planning to make this corpus available. The date currently is 2017, where we want to make this available to the research public, teachers, and everyone, anyone interested in this project.
You want to come?
Hi, I'm Daniela from Queen Mary. About the categorization of speakers into the different levels, did they come from a formal setting where you already knew whether they were A1 to C2, or were they categorized at a later point?
Well, the data, because we are closely working with Trinity College London as a testing board, come from their exams, and that these are graded exams at those particular levels, and we also have the result based on the exam. So based on this, we can actually assess the candidate's proficiency. So it is very thoroughly done.
Okay, I'm afraid I have to cut it off now. So if there's other questions, you can ask Václav afterwards, and we will go on to Claire Hardacre for the next speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Okay, so to begin my talk, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, which starts with summer of last year. Effectively, what happened was the Bank of England announced that they were going to remove the last remaining woman from a banknote. And there were a number of individuals who felt that this would effectively suggest that historically women had not done anything important enough to be represented on the banknotes in England. So an individual called Caroline Criado Perez campaigned to have a woman put on a banknote, and she was successful, which was fantastic, but she then received an enormous amount of abuse online. So I'm going to warn you that there will be one slide in which you will see some of the more graphic abuse, but I won't leave that slide up for very long. And there will be discussion of rape in this talk, I'm afraid. So if that's a warning in advance, if you do want to make a quiet exit, I'm absolutely fine with that. So given this particular scenario, we effectively applied to the ESRC. We were interested in looking at how and why people send abusive and threatening interactions online. Why do they think that it's okay to suddenly start sending rape threats to someone, for instance? Why is it suddenly okay to tell someone, I'm going to bomb your house at 11:48 and there will be no survivors? So we applied to the ESRC. They gave us an urgency grant of £200,000, and using this, we collected a month of data from beforehand and 2 months of data from after this particular instance with Caroline Criado Perez. When we started analysing the data, something that I realised quite quickly, though, was that you can't just look at these threats and this behaviour in isolation. It's not just that people go onto the internet and suddenly turn into horrible people, that there's a lot more going on than this. So I realised that we have to step back a bit, hence the title of the talk, and we have to look at other factors external to the internet that start to build up to this attitude that it's okay to behave like this. So I take quite a step back, and we're going to start with advertising and products, particularly for boys and girls. So I talk mainly about misogyny and males and females, but that will broaden out as we go through the talk. So we find, for instance, if you look in advertising and the way that products are marketed at men and women, that women are beautiful and that boys are brilliant and women are pink and boys are blue. And this doesn't just apply to colouring books for children. This isn't just, action figures for boys and dolls for girls. We find that this is pitched at adults as well. So something as simple as chocolate, and you would think, no, chocolate's not gendered. Absolutely is. It's not available in pink. It's not for girls. So interestingly, we have to assume that it's for boys. And if you thought, well, yes, okay, fine, there's, Diet Coke and there's Coke Zero, one for girls, one for boys. It can't really go much further than that. There are surely some things that cannot be touched by gender distinction. You would be wrong. There is the Miss Bic pen. In case your feminine hand is too small for a normal pen, there is a nice lavender one with flowers for you. So effectively, we have an entire construction within advertising that men and women are different, that women are pretty, that they're effectively being moving towards being objectified, and in some advertising being objectified quite a lot. But that's not just in advertising. When we look in other types of forums, if you like, we find it too. So in headlines, this is just one from TMZ. George Clooney reportedly engaged to hot, successful lawyer. It doesn't matter that she's a human rights lawyer. It's nice that successful is mentioned and a lawyer is mentioned, but the first thing is the fact that she's hot. Now, what's nice about this is that some people are starting to resist these kinds of discourses. So we find a really nice counterexample from a magazine called The Gender. And they produced this one, which I think is quite nice. So effectively, they put her first and her accomplishments first, and it's the greying actor that she's married to. So you can see how that really sort of starts to tackle these ideas. But it's not just in headlines as well. And this one is a little bit more of an unhappy example. So last year, or I think it might have been about a year and a half ago, there was the Steubenville case in America where there was a party, there were a lot of high school students there. I think most all of them were underage and they were drinking. There was effectively a lot of errors of judgment that went on that night with quite a lot of people. What happened was a lot of the football stars from the football team were there. They effectively raped a young lady. She was gang raped, she was unconscious, she was carried by her ankles and her wrists from party to party where she was assaulted numerous times. And what happens was they finally get enough evidence together, enough video footage and so forth. They take this to court. The young lady in question is sent death threats. She's hounded out of town. She has to leave town and change her identity because they feel that she is ruining their lives. And this is the reporting from CNN as the verdict of guilty is handed to two of these footballers, and they were the only two that were convicted. This is what the woman from CNN says. I've never experienced anything like it, Candy. It was incredibly emotional, incredibly difficult, even for an outsider like me, to watch what happened as these two young men that had such promising futures, star football players, very good students, literally watched as they believed their lives fell apart. Now, what about the victim? So we've got star football players, they're very good students, they're convicted rapists. And if you even look in the little blue band at the bottom, star football players, two high school football stars found guilty of rape. But it's all about how she has effectively destroyed their lives. The victim has effectively become the perpetrator. So this then leads us into, we've got these attitudes in advertising, in the media, even in the press when they're reporting on cases. And this then takes us into the online environment where we start to find people who have internalized some of these ideas and started to think that it's okay to behave in this kind of way online. So we come back to Caroline Criado Perez. She's been successful. She's receiving all kinds of threats online. And this is just one of many of the threats that she got. So I'll read a couple to you. So he says to her, blocked my other account, nice one, many more. So he's using, and we do know because he was actually convicted in the end and he spent time in jail for this. I think he used 4 accounts in the end. The police will do nothing, it's only Twitter. And then going up to the top one on the right, just think it could be somebody that knows you personally. Just to try and really set the intimidation level up there. It could be somebody that she is literally seeing face to face but doesn't know. Come to Geordieland, Newcastle, bitch. This is one of the reasons why he got convicted. He didn't realise that it's not smart to put your home city on Twitter when you're sending death threats to somebody. And then the last one, which was arguably one of the more menacing, I will find you, smiley face. And then individuals tried to jump in to protect her. So Stella Creasy, MP, tried to jump in to protect her and got tweets like this. I'm going to be the first thing you see when you wake up, and a picture. I believe this is a still from the film Halloween of a man holding a knife, and I think the message in there is pretty clear that, you know, it's a death threat. I'm going to very briefly show one slide, and I said I would do it quite quickly, of the number of threats, and this is a small selection that were sent to the women, and I'm going to put that off. Basically, they were inundated with a whole slew of threats. So we gathered the tweets from the month before, the 2 months after, and my interest, amongst many things, was to figure out what are the kinds of networks that these people start to form. How do they talk to each other? How do they get together? Because it's not just one individual. You have effectively loose networks of individuals ganging up, attacking someone. So this is everything from those 3 months. This was everybody tweeting at Criado Perez tweeting back. So this is effectively a lot of noise, and what we want to start to find are the people who are abusive. So we pulled out the people who were risky. And here you can see the blue ones are people who were sending things that are pretty horrible, like, you know, you're a bitch, you're nasty, you're ugly, things like that, but not illegal. The red ones are ones that are easily crossing the bounds of illegal. I'm coming to find you, I'm going to do terrible things to you. So you can see there we have quite a big network of people, and the thicker the lines are, the more communications they're sending. So you've repeat offenders sending again and again, and Criado Perez is the little grey dot in the middle. So, of course, my interest is in the really high-risk offenders. The low-risk ones are horrible, but, you know, freedom of speech. So we look at the high-risk ones and start to look at what else do they do apart from just sending horrible threats. Well, we've got the misogyny. We've already talked about that. So these are the people who are sending clearly, openly misogynistic tweets like, go make me a sandwich, you should be in the kitchen, I'm going to kill you if you don't, blah, blah, blah. But they also talk about genitalia, and I will let you fill in the blanks about what that's going to be. And some of these, and you'll notice that these are the same networks, and some of these individuals are repeat offenders for different things. They also talk about things like homophobia. So they're effectively sending threats to people who are gay. They're talking about being gay. One of the words, I apologize, is the word faggot comes up a lot. So there's lots of really offensive language about people who are gay. And then finally, we also have racism. So I'm just going to flick through those slides quite quickly again. So you've got your high-risk network, you've got your misogynist, and if you watch, you'll see the same offenders coming up again and again. all the way through. So we've got some people who are effectively doing abuse across the spectrum and some people who are just particularly misogynistic and so forth. So for me, it's particularly interesting when people form into networks because that has a really serious effect on how extreme you can become. The next slide effectively exemplifies exactly why I think this is so urgent. These two. So we have the individual from ISIS who's responsible for a number of beheadings. He appears to be from London, from England. And we have Elliot Rodger in the bottom right. In case you're not aware of this case, in Santa Barbara at the beginning of this year, he took his car and his gun and he killed 7 people. What effectively happened with Elliot Rodger, and I'll talk about him more because we know more about him, he felt that women were horrible, that they owed him sex and that they were refusing it to him, that they were ganging up, that they were all sort of in this big community of people who hated him. And so he was writing things online, he was posting videos, he was writing a manifesto where he was telling people over and over again, I hate those bitches, I think they're horrible, you know, how dare they turn me down? And then of course he took a gun and he shot people and he ran a few down. And effectively he joined communities where they reinforced his idea, they validated him and they said, yeah, you're right, you're absolutely right, women are horrible. There's a whole area of the internet called the manosphere. When we turn to the individual from ISIS, we know that individuals in this country and in other countries are joining groups where they find validation, where they are told, yes, you are, you know, being treated badly, you are alienated, we give you a cause and a purpose, you should go do this thing. So for me, those networks that we can find where people are really engaging in extreme behavior can potentially lead us to people who eventually go and do things like this. And that's why I think this is so important. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire, for doing that so fast. I'm sure there's lots of questions. No, keeping to time is what I meant to say. There's lots of questions there. Who wants to lead off on the questions? Yeah, back in over here we have a question. Again, could you say who you are?
Hi, my name's Amelia Sharman. I'm from LSE. I've personally done some research on networks in blogs and things, and I read quite a bit about networks on Twitter. Yeah. And I was interested in the ethical dimensions of your research. Ethical dimensions. Oh, yes. Because some researchers I know are looking at climate skeptical stuff on Twitter, and they've decided not to identify people in tweets in their actual research outputs. Whereas when I did my research, I decided to identify some people. So, and some people said, oh, it's like putting an arrow or, a target on my back. I would be really interested in your thoughts on how you go about doing your research.
It's something that we are grappling with at this exact moment, because the problem is, on the one hand, we've identified a bunch of people who are really serious, they're horrible, they're sending the most vile and appalling comments to people. And so on the one hand, you have to feel like, well, they've done this, they chose their action, like in the case of the Steubenville football stars, they chose their action, should they pay the consequences? And if I happen to expose what they've done to a wider audience, well, then maybe they shouldn't have done that. On the other hand, as you say, potentially we have people who have mental health problems, maybe they were drunk, maybe there was something going on. So we've kind of come to an awkward halfway point where Twitter's terms of use actually say that if you use their API, sorry, is my mic really bad? If you use their API, you have to make it possible for any tweet that you replicate to be trackable back to the person who sent the tweet. So to follow the terms of their API and to do the research, it looks like we're going to have to do that. But it's something that we're still debating now before we publish any of the research, and some of them have been submitted and we're going to have to work on that. It's really hard.
Okay. Other questions? Over here, yes. Yep. Another online question.
Yeah, going back to Google+, we've got a question from Carolyn Brown, and she says, is it valid to allied nasty remarks on Twitter with the ISIS beheader and a murderer?
What I would suggest is the point of this one was about networks and about people coming together to form sort of groups where effectively they find people validating their ideas, that they say, I'm being treated badly, and people say, yes, you are, here's some anecdotal evidence to agree with this. How can we get our revenge? How can we get our own way back? And so we know that there are sites out there where people are being actively groomed into radicalized ways of thinking. We know that there are sites that are pushing individuals into effectively going to bomb somewhere or whatever. So in effect, it's kind of linked to this because it's the same sort of pattern. You have networks of people all producing the same ideas. It's like an echo chamber. It gets louder. People support those ideas. And then eventually you do get someone who stops talking about it online and actually just goes and does. For me, I think there is some link between the two.
Questions?
Data again.
Yep.
It's not a very linguistic question, but I just wonder if you thought about that. Well, you say that these Boolean networks could potentially lead to identifying more serious offenders.
Mm-hmm.
You said, though, that, for instance, for one of the cases, there was one person who had 4 different Twitter accounts.
Yes, yeah.
And don't people create a separate Twitter account for each instance? You know, for instance, if I wanted to troll this lady who was campaigning for putting a woman on the banknote, I would create one account and then I would create a different one for trolling someone else. So those networks would be different in each case, wouldn't they?
It is difficult. I mean, fortunately, we've got all the links of everyone who sent things to her. And if they were extreme enough, then they should come up in the high-risk network. But you're absolutely right that one of the strategies that they use is to create multiple accounts. And you have some people who seem to have hours on their hands and they create like dozens of accounts. Actually, interestingly, I'm back in London on the 28th of November. I'm having a meeting with Twitter specifically to talk to them about ways that they can overcome this. So they're considering things like if multiple accounts are created very quickly from the same IP address, that they start to put more and more blocks in place, prove that you're a human, you have to ring them up, things like this. So they make it much harder. But at the moment, it's a really serious problem. It makes it much more difficult.
Hi, Elaine Boyd, Trinity College London. Let's see if I formulate this right. It strikes me, groups have always existed, haven't they, to validate each other and do appalling things. What seems to be happening via online stuff is that people feel free to act as individuals, as they've got this army, sort of metaphorical army behind them almost, and they can act as individuals rather than a large offensive group. Given this is related to a corpus study, have you done any work on how far they copy each other's language?
Actually, you're onto something that we're doing. One of the things that we do is we try and follow, or we try and find instances where they do, it's a horrible example, but the word rape, for instance, some of the users specifically spell it R-A-E-P. And they spell the word porn, P-R-0-N. So what we can find is where they kind of join a network, they assimilate the norms of how that network communicates and interacts, and then they start using the same things. So rape train comes up a lot, and the word rape's misspelled. And effectively, we can, not in a perfect way, but you can start to identify where have these individuals come from elsewhere on the internet. So there are other sites that we know that they use where they coalesce. They go back and say, here's something really fun that's happening, let's all jump on board, and they all effectively come over from that other site. So you can't do it in a perfect way. You can't say, definitely this person must have come from that site, but it starts to give you a good indication. If you know how those other sites interact, it starts to tell you where they've probably come from.
Do you see do you see a build-up of certain language resulting, certain words or certain phrases resulting in more extreme or some kind of action?
That's something we haven't gone on to yet. I've looked very passingly at escalation. Of course, that's something that we're really interested in. We have some timelines where you can see escalation in number of tweets, and we have some where you can see escalation in rising threat from one account. But what we haven't done is looked specifically at, more use of particular sort of units that lead to that kind of thing, I'm afraid.
Okay. Thanks. I'm going to have to cut it off here. Could I just say, Claire often has to explain her complex ideas in 3 minutes, so she has an excellent, thoughtful blog. I think if you Google Claire Hardacre with a K in the Hardacre, you will find that blog, and it's very useful for following up some of these ideas. But for now, we'll have to cut off this discussion here, and the next speaker will be Elena Semino talking about end-of-life care.
Okay, I think like Claire, I have to give a health warning, which is kind of literally my case. I'll be talking about different metaphors for cancer and end of life. And so my presentation includes several quotations from patients, cancer sufferers, talking about their experiences of illness. And this, I'm sure, has touched many of you. And in fact, let me start from my personal experience in relation to this. I'm Italian, as you can hear. 25 years ago, my father was diagnosed with incurable pancreatic cancer and died 10 months after diagnosis. In those days in Italy, cancer sufferers were not told what was wrong with them. So the consultant who operated on my father unsuccessfully told us after the operation, this is what we're going to say to him, and made up a much less serious illness that my father was supposed to have. We really didn't have the tools to challenge this decision. And so one of the many difficulties that we had in the period when my father was dying was that we didn't have adequate language to talk about what was going on. Cancer was so taboo that people didn't know they had it. Luckily, nowadays, things have changed. They've changed in Italy and they've changed here. Cancer is still the thing that people are most afraid of, and it is still taboo to some extent, but not nearly to the same extent. So it is discussed in the media, by charities, in informal conversations, and certainly patients know what's going on when they're ill. However, having language doesn't mean that all problems are solved, because the issue is finding the right language and making sure that the language that we use is appropriate and sensitive, especially for cancer sufferers. And sometimes things go wrong, and especially the metaphors that we use for cancer sometimes may be detrimental in some way for patients. This point has been made, much better than I could make it, by Kate Granger, who is a 32-year-old doctor from Yorkshire, who has incurable cancer. She wrote a Guardian article in April, and this is how the article starts. She lost a brave fight. If anyone uses those words, after my death, wherever I am, I will curse them. Later on, she says, I do not want to feel a failure about something beyond my control. I refuse to believe my death will be because I didn't battle hard enough. And then later, after all, cancer has arisen from within my own body, from my own cells. To fight it would be waging a war on myself. So she, as I said, puts very eloquently the problem with one of the dominant metaphors we have for being ill with cancer, which is that we're fighting the cancer. And one of the consequences of that metaphor is that when the cancer becomes incurable, the person can be described as losing the battle. So we were interested in this, and we wanted to look at the metaphors that people actually use nowadays in the UK to talk about cancer. And we looked at three groups of people. This is our data. I won't go into all the details. We looked at three groups of people. We looked at patients with cancer. We looked at family carers looking after a relative with cancer, and healthcare professionals. And for each group, we have interviews and large quantities of online forum contributions for a total of 1.5 million words. So we use a combination of traditional, if you like, manual analysis, looking for metaphors, with corpus-based methods to analyze metaphor using this very large quantity of data. Now, first of all, why do we look at metaphors in the first place? Metaphor involves talking and potentially thinking about one thing in terms of another, when the two things are different, but we can perceive some similarity between them. So being ill and fighting a battle are different things, but we can perceive a similarity between them, so we talk, amongst other things, about being ill in terms of fighting. Metaphors are frequent in language, and they're particularly important when we talk about experiences that may be complex, abstract, subjective, and sensitive, such as being ill, emotions around being ill, death, and dying. But metaphors are important because the metaphors you choose affect how you might perceive that experience and how the people you're speaking or writing for might perceive that experience. In other words, different metaphors frame the topic in different ways, highlighting some aspects and backgrounding others. In the framing that is facilitated by the fight metaphor for cancer, the illness itself is the enemy that you're fighting. That is part of the framing, because there is an enemy in a fight. And within that framing, again, if you're dying of the illness, you're losing the battle. That is part of the framing. This particular framing is very dominant, especially nowadays in the UK, not just in the UK, and is not limited to those cases where you might find those words, fight, battle, or war. it is actually more widespread than that. So cancer charities, when they're trying to persuade us to give money, which is a great thing, and they do a great job, they often use slogans which may not necessarily involve the words fight, battle, or war, but still suggest that the illness is an opponent. So we have things like cancer, we're coming to get you, or it's cancer's turn to be afraid, or the current campaign, which again is doing excellent work, Stand Up to Cancer. So if you're a sufferer who isn't quite used or who doesn't quite accept this particular framing, you might feel that it is not appropriate to talk about something that is part of you as an opponent that you should be fighting. Now, luckily, we have a whole range of metaphors at our disposal, and other metaphors can be used for cancer. The most prominent being, thank you, most prominent being, can you hear me? Those of you online, I have no idea. The most prominent being that of cancer as a journey. So let's look at somebody who prefers that framing rather than the fight framing. A journalist, Melanie McFadyen, a few years ago, writing about her experience of breast cancer, she says, I read obituaries and always look at the dates of birth. Those of my vintage have often died after a long battle with cancer. People with cancer have enough to deal with without feeling that every day of their lives must be a battle with the disease. Why should people with cancer be expected to take up arms? It is better to see cancer as a journey. Everyone says that being positive helps you to come through, and being positive during a journey seems easier to me than being positive during a war in which the enemy is all around you. She prefers that framing, and notice that within the journey framing, there is no opponent, right? That metaphor doesn't include an opponent. The cancer may be a road that you travel on, even possibly a traveling companion, but no opponent. So you won't be surprised, in the UK there is quite a lot of awareness of issues to do with language. So recent NHS policy documents, including the NHS Cancer Reform Strategy, which was published in 2007, do not include deliberately words such as battle or war. Instead, as you can see, the term cancer journey is used for the experience of patients, and expressions such as pathway are used for different models of care and different courses of treatment. So then the question for us was, okay, this is the background, but how do people, especially these three different groups I mentioned, patients, family carers, and healthcare professionals, use metaphor now in interviews and in online forum contributions? And here I'm interested specifically in patients. Do they use fight metaphors, and how? Do they use journey metaphors, and how? And do we manage to find some evidence that maybe one metaphor is better than the other, okay? As often with research, what you often find is that things are rather complicated. So, these are extracts from our data. The first thing I can say is that our data provides plenty of evidence that there are a large number of people for whom the idea of being ill as fighting or being engaged in a battle can be negative and can have a kind of disempowering effect. So one person says, it's sad that anyone, but especially younger people like yourself, find themselves with this battle to fight. So using the battle metaphor to express the unfairness of the situation, lack of acceptance of the situation. Another person says it must be dispiriting when you're battling as hard as you can not to be given the armor to fight in. So here the person wants to fight, but within that frame they're not being given the right equipment, and this clearly is an allusion to not being prescribed the right treatment. So that disempowerment of the patient, not having control of how your illness is being treated. And the next example is the one that to me epitomizes what is wrong, what can be wrong with this metaphor. I feel such a failure that I'm not winning this battle. So this person finds themselves with an illness that cannot be cured and feels a failure because of that. The battle metaphor can make the person themselves feel responsible and guilty for the fact that they're not getting better, when in fact it's nothing to do with them. Okay, this way things seem relatively simple, but they're not actually simple, because for some people, this particular metaphor seems to provide a sense of meaning, purpose, motivation, and even a sense of pride. So some people embrace the identity of fighter. I am such a fighter. My consultants recognize that I was a born fighter. Other people find it motivating. We're young women with families, but that is our trump card, a different metaphor. That alone is my desire to fight and win. And one person says very explicitly, cancer and the fighting of it is something to be very proud of. So for some patients, some of the time, the metaphor seems to work well. When we looked at journey metaphors, we actually found a similar picture. So there is no opponent, and clearly for some patients, the metaphor can be empowering. So one person uses a journey metaphor to express the fact that within that negative experience, there may be the opportunity to appreciate things about life in a new, positive way. My journey may not be smooth, but it certainly makes me look up and take notice of the scenery. So a positive aspect. Another person uses it to express a sense of satisfaction at being able to achieve things. Just when I think I've gone as far as I can go, I get a happy surprise by being able to push myself that little bit extra. And then a great advantage of the journey metaphor is that it can express the idea of companionship in a very positive way. So one person says, the rocks in our paths are easier to handle when we're all in it together. The best people to help you are the ones who've been there before or are there, heading there with you. So the idea that people with the same illness are travelers on the same journey, and some people guide others. But, and now you'll expect this, some patients use journey metaphors to express negative emotions, and the metaphor in these cases contributes to a sense of disempowerment. So one person says, cancer is a journey. Some people have similar experiences to others on that journey, but by and large, the journey has many twists and turns. That means no two people go the exact same way. So for this person, the journey is a lonely journey in spite of everything. And then the journey becomes an impossible journey. I think it is like trying to drive a coach and horses uphill with no back wheels on the coach. So the metaphor is used to express a kind of hopelessness. The next person uses a journey metaphor to express lack of acceptance, frustration. How the hell am I supposed to know how to navigate this road I do not even want to be on when I've never done it before? And the final example is somebody who refers to the patients not as being in control of the journey, but as passengers with no control on the journey. I only pop by every now and again because it saddens my heart to read of the passengers nearing the end of their journey and those recently having finished their journey. So what we find is a complex picture. Clearly, fight metaphors can have harmful effects for many patients, but they seem to work for some. And conversely, journey metaphors can often be empowering and positive, but they clearly are linked with feelings of frustration and disempowerment for some patients. But the question we're often asked is that it? Aren't there any other metaphors? They're harder to find. These two patterns are much more frequent, but there are people who use different metaphors. So this is somebody who wrote a comment on The Guardian's website on the article by Kate Granger that I opened with. This person says, cancer is part of me. The cure for cancer is the acceptance of it. To heal is to meet the rogue cells within and convince them to sing in tune with the rest of the body. I love this one. So the cells are rogue cells, so there's a sense of a kind of enemy, but actually the illness itself is lack of musical harmony in the body, and the healing is reestablishing that musical harmony. This is a different framing, and a framing that may not be for everybody, but that people might find useful. My final example, just in case Greg is worried, is from a very long and very inspiring article by Andrew Greystone last year on the BBC News magazine online. Amongst many other things, he says, "For me, cancer arrived as an unwelcome lodger, parking itself in the back room and demanding attention. For 3 years, I tried to be a courteous, if unwilling, host. Eventually, the time came to invite my cancer to leave. She's left the place in a bit of a mess, and I'm conscious that she has kept the key. Still, I'm hopeful that in due course, all I will be left with is the rich memory of time spent with a stranger I never expected to meet." So, to conclude, metaphors are important and they're inescapable. They can, in some cases, be harmful, but they can also be useful tools, resources that we can use to make meaning out of our experiences, to make sense of our experiences. However, unfortunately, things are not simple. We're all different, so it is hard to say that a particular metaphor is always good or always bad. We've seen that fight metaphors can be negative, but they can be positive for some, and the same applies to journey metaphors. So when we speak to healthcare professionals, we can't simply say, get rid of these metaphors and promote the other metaphors and everything will be okay. What we need to say is, pay attention to what patients say. Let's pay attention to each other. If somebody uses a metaphor that seems to work well for them, go along with it, encourage it. But if somebody uses a metaphor that seems to be disempowering or even generate feelings of guilt when the person has no responsibility, that is the time to suggest an alternative. And equally, we need to be mindful when we talk to each other, whether we're ill or not, about the consequences that the metaphors we use may have for other people. In other words, we're all different. There are no good or bad metaphors in absolute terms. The important thing is that, especially when we are ill, we're enabled and encouraged to adopt and develop the metaphors that work best for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. And I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. I know a lot of people are touched by this topic and interested in it, and we got a much better summary than you'll see today in the Daily Mail. So could we have a microphone here? Down here, I've got a question. And let's see if we have one online. Okay, we need to hear it online too, yes.
Okay. Thank you. That was very interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I can hear.
Eliza Kiddis. Can you tell us how you actually collected, how you picked those metaphors? The obvious thing is journey, cancer, path, route, but you also have some without any of those. I mean, the word navigate, did you include that as well, as far as heading?
Yeah, okay.
And
sorry.
Also, if you've actually chosen this lexical field and not another, how do you know that we don't have more metaphors? Because these are the obvious we hear about all the time.
Yeah, so no, thank you for that question. I can go into the technical details. Okay, what we did was we have a corpus of 1.5 million words. We selected a representative sample, which is about 92,000 words, and we analyzed that in the traditional way, manually going through. There were 3 of us doing the coding. So we ended up with a bunch of expressions that were used metaphorically in that data. And what we then did was we used a semantic annotation tool that some of you, including those of you online, are familiar with, the uses tool in W Matrix. So we allocated the words that we found to semantic fields. And then we used a tool for looking not for words in the big corpus, but areas of meaning. So we looked for words related to journey, but not specific words. So we said to the software, find us words to do with journeys, find us words to do with warfare. In analyzing the sample corpus, we identified lots of other patterns. So we've got sports and games, we've got religion and the supernatural, we've got constraint, we've got openness, we've got wholeness, we've got obstacles. So the patterns that we looked for are much broader than just journeys and fights. So what I can say is we come up with a reasonably systematic analysis of the metaphors in our corpus. What I cannot say, we found them all, because there is no way of finding them all. But we certainly cast a net much wider than just journeys and fights, yeah.
Okay. And it sounds like there's a question online there. So do you want to...
Yep. We have a question from Nukash, who asks, I would like to know if you noticed any correlation between the use of particular metaphors and the severity progression of the disease among the patients in your research.
Okay, this is a question that we're often asked, and I would like to say that I can provide an answer, but I can't. The online forum data we use is obviously people decide how much information they want to give about themselves. We actually selected patients who describe themselves as having advanced cancer, but we don't know exactly where they are. So we cannot, I cannot answer that question. What I can say, however, which came out of my talk, is that different metaphors may be more or less suitable at different points in the progression of the illness. And even though I have said no metaphor is always good or bad, I would say that in the final stages, the fight or battle metaphor is not a particularly good metaphor to have, precisely because it's got this consequence, this framing of losing the battle. So I can't answer that question, but I would like to suggest that different metaphors may be more or less suitable at different stages in the illness. It would have to be another project that looks at that specifically.
Okay, to use a metaphor, I'm going to have to cut it off here. Can I suggest with Elena and her colleague Veronica Kohler, their Twitter feed is not only good in itself, but leads you to a lot of the other end-of-life care professionals who are tweeting a lot and are also fighting this battle. So you might follow up some of her ideas, starting with Twitter then. Thank you very much. Okay. I see that I see that Tony McHenry has arrived from the airport, so we're going to get a three-voiced treatment of the last presentation here on words yesterday and today.
Great. I thought I'd just start briefly by talking about my own experience with using the British National Corpus when we first constructed it in the early 1990s. In 1994, we made this available with our partners, 100 million words of British English, 90 million words of written material, but most importantly, I think, 10 million words of spontaneous speech. People had been carrying around tape recorders, recording everyday conversations. And in 1994, I made myself terrifically popular with most of the users of the university mainframe by clogging it up one weekend, generating a word list. And this for me was one of the most exciting moments in my life. And I took all of the barbs that were thrown at me, and there were many by people whose programs were slowed that weekend, because on the Monday, I could do something that nobody had ever done before. And it's rare that you can say that in life. I looked at what 10 million words of speech looked like and compared that to what 90 million words of writing. And we started to see the very real differences that exist between speech and writing. I found my experience of using the BNC, especially the spoken part, inspirational. I started to realize that tucked away in that spoken language were all sorts of interesting things that people had overlooked or neglected, either willfully or perhaps not so willfully. So Greg was talking before about hesitations, pauses, fillers. They're fascinating things. And then I went on and wrote a whole book on the topic of swearing in English. People do a lot of it. We don't often study it as linguists, largely because we didn't really know how, but lots of it there in the corpus spontaneously. Before you get excited, it's a very scholarly book. And when I give a talk at the university, certainly once, one of my students paid one of my greatest ever compliments by coming up after the lecture and saying, "You know what, Tony, you make swearing boring." Okay, it's wonderful. But also, a little bit like me, it's now old. It's 20 years older than it was when it was first released. To put that in perspective, Robbie, who's going to talk in a moment, was barely born when the British National Corpus was produced, and when the material that was recorded for it was actually recorded, he wasn't born. We know language changes. We know that the crucible of that change is very often speech. It's hidden away in speech. It's not recorded in the writing. Those changes happen in speech. And we have 20 years of change to look out for. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Robbie Love from Lancaster University, and especially Claire Dembry from Cambridge University Press, who have started the titanic task of reconstructing the British National Corpus in the 21st century. And they're going to tell you about it now, with a focus on the spoken component. Robbie, Claire.
Thanks for that introduction, Tony. Hi everyone, I'm Claire Dembry. I'm a research manager at Cambridge University Press.
And I'm Robbie Love, and I'm a PhD student at CAS at Lancaster University.
So as Tony said, we're here to tell you today about our exciting new research project, which basically replicates the original BNC project in that we're aiming to collect a really large number of informal, spontaneous spoken conversations. Our aim is to collect 10 million words to match with the existing BNC collection from people right across the UK. It's a fantastic project. Thank you. Our collection method is a little bit different to that sort of employed by the original BNC. And we've tested it over the past year at Cambridge University Press. And it's new and it's interesting because largely it employs smartphones and the prevalence of smartphones in all of our lives. Basically what we've asked people to do is to make recordings using their smartphone or their tablet or their laptop and send them to us. And we transcribe them and then analyse the resultant conversations. Sorry, I should say that when we finish the project, we intend for it to be fully publicly accessible as well.
Yeah, so one of the many, many questions that we're hoping to answer with the new Spoken BNC 2014 is, well, how has spoken British English changed in recent years? Or in other words, what are the words, the spoken words of yesterday and those of today? Well, in this case, as Tony mentioned, the yesterday that we're referring to at the moment is, well, the 1990s. And you might think, well, that wasn't too long ago, but, you know, we can answer this question because this is the sequel of the original Spoken BNC, which, as Tony said, was released about 20 years ago. Now, the problem we have is that 20 years have passed, and there are still some researchers out there today who are using the Spoken BNC as almost a proxy for present-day spoken English. But we can't really say that 1990s talk, 1990s chit-chat is present day anymore. And as Tony said, I was barely alive 20 years ago. So it really is, yeah, you too.
Me too.
Not quite so much as me then. You know, so 1994 really is no longer anywhere near the present day in language terms.
Yeah, so our project's already underway. We've made a great start. We've collected it from around 200 speakers so far, and we have around 2 million words that we have ready, and we've transcribed it, and we've done some initial analysis that we're going to talk about next. So we were interested initially in the difference between the language used in the 90s and the language used now. So one thing we did is to look at the words that had changed in frequency. So words that had gone up, so words that perhaps we didn't even use in the 90s or that we didn't use as much. And words that had also gone down dramatically in frequency. So the words of yesterday, the words of the 90s, and the words of today. So those that have gone down, first of all, how we do? Yeah, so these were the most frequent, the biggest differences, if you like. So we have the word fortnight, marvellous,
Keep clicking.
marvellous, and fetch, Walkman. Does anyone still have a Walkman? Poll, as in poll tax. Catalogue. This is from the Argos catalogue from 1994. Some wonderful hair. Pussycat, marmalade, drawers, and Cheerio. So a bit of a mixed bag of words, and we don't exactly know for sure why these words have shown such a decline. We can make some suggestions. So perhaps the drop in frequency of the word marmalade reflects changes in tastes. Perhaps we're eating croissants or cereal bars for breakfast instead of marmalade. And perhaps we're all listening to our iPods rather than our Walkmans. I'm sure you can all relate to that one, certainly. But to be honest, we don't know. We need to finish the project and collect more conversations and find out if these truly are trends or if, in fact, they're just reflect the conversations that we have already collected. Now for the words that have increased. Does anyone have any suggestions? Internet, yeah. Google, brilliant. Facebook, internet, website, awesome. Email, Google, as he said, smartphone, iPhone, essentially, and treadmill. So again, an interesting group of words, perhaps some that group together more coherently than the other ones, as in there's a strong sort of digital aspect to them, as you rightly pointed out. A few that we think are really interesting are perhaps Facebook, email, and smartphone. Bearing in mind these are all taken from transcriptions of spoken language. All of these forms of communication typically don't involve speaking to each other, writing on each other's Facebook walls or sending each other emails, don't involve spoken interaction, but yet we're telling each other about them. We're talking about what we've read on Facebook or the emails that we've sent, and we think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so aside from simply tracking which words are going up and down, which it is very interesting in itself, we believe that if we carry on to collect enough data, we can say something about how social attitudes towards certain issues are changing over time. We said that one of the words that had increased in the new data that we've got so far is the word treadmill. Perhaps this means that somehow we're kind of speaking and thinking more healthily, and other findings do seem to suggest that. The word calories is twice as frequently spoken as it was in the 1990s in the data we have so far. Likewise, the word carbs for carbohydrate is much more prominent now. But aside from that, if we sort of carry on with this health sort of theme, we can also look at food and drinks to see how these tastes have changed over time. So we found out, well, that in the 1990s, tea was the most spoken about drink. As a very quick fire run through a few of the other drinks, we also found out that, well, nothing has changed. Tea is still the most spoken about drink, including alcoholic drinks in the data so far. What else can we say? Well, coffee was also very high, in second place in the 1990s data, but it seems that perhaps caffeine is being replaced by, well, alcohol. Wine and beer seem to have overtaken in the rankings. And we can also see, well, things that were perhaps more fashionable in the 90s and spoken of more, sherry and brandy, they've kind of fallen out of fashion a little bit. And we've got things like gin, vodka, and champagne shooting up the rankings.
We also looked at some food items, and sadly, some old favourites have fallen out of favour, it seems. So we see a decline in the word chips, salad, crisps, fish and chips, custard, and Sunday dinner. They've all gone down in use. Salad's interesting considering we're talking about health more, yet we're talking about salad less. I'm not sure what we can say for that one. And those foods shown an increase. We have pizza, curry, gravy, Thai, rice, and takeaway. But for all the foods that have gone down and all the foods that have gone up in our conversations, one thing we can say is that cake beats everything. We talk about cake both in the 90s data collection set and in the one we collected recently more than any other food item.
Yeah. So we're going to finish off with, we're going to skip this one out the way, as interesting as it looks. We're going to finish off with one final example to kind of show on a slightly more serious note how these changes in attitudes towards certain groups, social groups, can be shown in this sort of data. So we looked at the adjectives that are used to describe women in both the 90s data and the data we have so far. So these are the most commonly used adjectives for woman. We have old, young, stupid, pretty, big, naked, nice, silly, married, and beautiful. This was the situation 20 years ago. If we fast forward to today, well, the first two are the same, old and young, but then we have other, little, many, international, different, crazy, and 50-year-old, and gypsy. Now, we can't really explain exactly what's going on here. We're wanting to collect more data to see whether these sorts of findings hold true. But what we can say, at least, the sort of most striking difference is that women seem much less likely to be described based on their appearance, or even worse, kind of sexualized. Certainly naked has disappeared there. So in this sense, a corpus of the size of the spoken BNC, when we complete it over the years, could be as useful, if not more useful than, say, survey data for gauging the tastes and opinions of the public.
So thanks so much for listening to us today. We'll end there. We found the findings that we've got so far really interesting, and we hope you have too. Clearly, we do need more conversations, and we really would welcome your participation in this project. Please do send us an email if you'd like to know more about the project, and if you'd like to send us your conversations to listen to too. I should also mention, I've been well versed, that you can read more about the project in the new edition of Society Now magazine on page 24 and 25, so check that out. Thanks.
Thank you.
Again, I think we have time for just a couple questions now. Yes, in the back corner over there.
Hi, I'm Phil Martin from City University. Can you tell us a bit about the conversational situations that you use to collect your data?
Yeah. We've actually, it's been quite an open call for participation. We haven't said you have to do this or you have to record or talk about these things. we tend to find people talking in all kinds of situations, when they're down the pub, when they're making dinner, when they're just having a coffee. So it's been really sort of wide ranging so far. We haven't specified or put any restrictions in place.
Just thinking about maybe the language arguments. I don't know how that would seem to be something that isn't explored as much. I don't know if it's something people would volunteer and put forward. So.
It's amazing the things people have submitted so far. You would be surprised. I'm sure there'll be some argumentative undertones in there in various places, yeah.
Okay, there's one online and there was one back in the corner, so we have time for that. Yeah.
I've got lots of questions actually, but I'm going to ask this one because I really like the look of it. So this is from Glenn, and he asks, is there any way to check that some conversations aren't faked or scripted? Have any suspicious ones been removed?
Yeah, it's really hard to, when we do listen to them, we listen to all the contributions we get in. I mean, I think it's hard. I've had a few that where we've gone back to people who've sent them in. So we've had ones that have been extremely stilted and set up as more like an interview, where we've gone back and said that we can't accept them. But we find that because people are using their smartphones, they tend to put them on the table and forget about them. Quite often, I'm sure if you go to the pub or wherever for a coffee, quite often people have their phone on the table anyway. It's not an unusual thing, so people do relax, and we haven't really had lots of people trying to fleece us so far, so that's really good.
And there was a question back in the corner there. Do you want? Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Jo D'Souza and I'm a lecturer at King's. I just wondered how you, are you going to target who you're trying to get conversations from as you go through the project so that you do really collect British conversations as opposed to groups of folk who might be much more familiar with smartphones or much more likely to hand in?
Yeah, we started with a very general call. We did a sort of big national media campaign earlier on in the summer, and we basically used that to see what we would get. And now that we know a little bit more about the certain age groups and regions that the recordings are coming from, we're starting now to target slightly more specifically. So particularly at the moment, we're interested in age groups. So we're looking specifically for children and teenagers and also older people. We seem to have quite a strong kind of flow of sort of recordings of middle-aged people, but we're looking for those sort of two outer brackets there in terms of age. And certain regions as well, sort of the Wales and Scotland and the Northern Ireland aren't so strong at the moment. So we're looking for those areas in particular. Yeah.
The same ethnicities, or are you not going to go that far?
We're looking for people whose first language is British English. So that's where we're going with that. Yeah.
I'm not in it. Okay, one more from online here. There.
Lawrence asks, the high rank of 50-year-old suggests that it appeared frequently in just a few conversations. So did you look at the dispersion of terms in the corpus?
Yes, I mean, so far we're only working with the initial sample that we've collected. So Lawrence is right to point out that such a specific term like 50-year-old doesn't suggest that loads and loads and loads of people are talking about 50-year-olds and nothing else. The sample that we're working with is 2 million words so far, so about a fifth or thereabouts of the total that we're aiming for. And that contains a speech of around about 200 speakers from a good enough range around England. But of course, it does mean in some of these lists that we are trying to produce at the moment, that lower down in the rankings, you do get certain specific terms may or may not be ironed out as we collect more data. And that's why we want to collect more. You know, we want to make it as rigorous as possible.
What is there time for one more signaling? We've got a lot online, so is there? Okay, yeah.
Can I ask? It's very interesting when you actually find what new words we use when they have a referential content. So when they refer to artifacts, for example, the mobile or the treadmill, very interesting. But maybe it reflects our changing cultures. But maybe if we look at
words like what comes next to woman, how woman is characterized. So actually showing our assessment, our stance, how we position ourselves to the actual referential entities, you know, object words. How can I put it in plain English? For example, sexy. I think we use the word sexy much more frequently now than we did in the 70s, for example. We have the word sexing up since Gilligan's use, okay? 2003, it entered our dictionaries, not before 2003. And also we read in Russell Bradd's new book, on the inside of the jacket, it has a vision of a funnier and sexier world, something we would never read, I think, in the written form as well. Yeah. So how can you go about picking those assessment words?
Well, I think the great thing about this, as we said at the beginning, is that this is going to be publicly accessible. So even if we don't have sort of a full agenda of research that we want to do, it doesn't matter, because once we complete collecting the corpus, once it's finished, it's going to be released so that anyone from anywhere can do their own research interests. So if sexy is something that you're interested in terms of research, then you can go ahead and do that using corpus methods.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying that certainly these are kind of interesting nuggets that we've picked out to spark conversation and to get people interested in the project. These don't accurately really, I think, reflect either of our research interests, but they're things that have captured people's imagination and have sort of started the talking point, hopefully, to get other people interested and to progress their project. Yeah.
Can we spot the change in those terms?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Tony wanted to say something there.
What we'll look for, this is a bit of fun, a few words on the screen, but what we'll look for in those circumstances are collocates of the word. So we want to look at changing patterns of collocation around a word. I'm a strong believer in the construction of social attitudes through collocation. So say, for example, if we find that sexy was actually measurable as a strong collocate of woman in the early 1990s, but it's lost that bond. Think back to Václav's slide early on, either the arrow has disappeared or it's lengthened and moved away. That's how we'll start to measure that when we have enough data. At the moment, 2 million words is lovely, but why 10 million words was lovely in the past is that that's sufficient to start answering that type of question. At the moment, with 2 million words, we don't really have enough data, I think, to start using the statistics that we'd use to generate graphs like those that Václav showed. But when we do, I think especially using a tool like that, we'll have a very nice visual impression of what concepts are being attracted to or have been repelled or broken away from certain words.
Okay, I'm going to give Tony the last word here, as I so often do. What I want to do is begin to wrap up now. I want to say a few things. I would give you a nice academic summary of issues like ethics and collection and visualization and applications, but I'll leave that to you to discuss during the reception, and I won't do that. I'm going to ask for thanks to the people, but first can I remind you, you're probably sitting on something that looks like this, and it would be very useful to get your feedback. We've got a good, busy hall here, and it'd be useful to get your feedback on this event so that we can shape other ones like it. And finally, can I ask for a round of applause for all 6 of the presenters. Now, part of the reason we've been keeping to time so much is that I know people want to talk to them face to face and perhaps not in front of a room full of people, so we've left enough time for you to corral them during the reception. The reception is through there, over there, so we'd like you to move in that direction and perhaps go up to the people and ask them the questions you've been holding back on. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.